Thank you so much, Steve.
I hear I'm overdressed, though, that some of the speakers showed up in, like, jogging outfits.
We welcome diversity.
Apparently, it's great.
Of all types. If you haven't worn shorts and no socks, you haven't really been part of our conference, I guess. No, we are what we are. So, tell us about the third. Let's pretend there's a person in the audience who has not read The Third Wave. Could you just lay out your theory of the third wave?
Sure. First of all, it's great to be here, and it's great you're hosting this conference, and the focus on innovation and job creation, I think, is obviously central, and hopefully something that folks down both ends of the street will spend more time focusing on in the months ahead. In terms of the book, the way I think about the three waves of the internet. The first wave, and Gary kind of referenced this, we started AOL in 1985, so 32 years ago. At the time, only 3% of people were online, and they were online 1 hour a week. And if you went to the Consumer Electronics Show there, you saw all kinds of things, but not a lot of online stuff, because it was still early days. Obviously, it took off, and by the end of that first wave, which was building the on-ramps and educating people about the reason they should get online, it went from an idea that nobody really knew about or cared about when we got started to, by the end of that first wave, the year 2000 or so, essentially everybody was connected and they couldn't live without it. That then set the stage for the second wave, really the last 15 years or so, which for the most part has been about software, apps, running on top of the internet, particularly running on top of smartphones, and all in Facebook and Waze and Twitter and so forth. Those were some of the iconic second wave companies. With lean startups, often dorm room startups, focused around software, focused around apps, and obviously a number of huge successes there. The third wave is the next logical progression of the internet, from that building it to building on top of it to really integrating it in seamless and pervasive and sometimes even invisible ways throughout our lives, and really in the process changing how we think about healthcare, how we think about learning, how we think about food and agriculture, how we think of energy, transportation, smart cities, an amazing number of things that haven't really changed all that much in the first wave or second wave, but are going to change a lot in the third wave. The reason I decided to finally, at the ripe old age of 58, actually write a book is I realized that some of the dynamics, some of the themes, some of the strategies that worked in the first wave were not that relevant in the second wave, but were going to become very important again in the third wave. So I could write a book about the future, kind of where we're going, and tell some stories from the past.
So if you were Steve Case and you were 22 years old, starting out without any family money as you started out in Hawaii, and you were going to do something, what would you do?
Well, I'd pick one of the third wave sectors, probably healthcare. It's 1/6 of the economy. Everybody knows it's challenged, and how do you create better healthcare, more convenience, more personalization, better outcomes at lower cost. And I think there's opportunities to do that, and in the process disrupt something that obviously is pretty important, maybe the most important thing in our lives, and also take on an industry that's huge, 1/6 of the economy. So that, it ultimately depends on what people are passionate about. Some may want to figure out ways to improve how learning happens in classrooms. Some may want to think about smart cities, or the idea of the Internet of everything. Some may want to think about there are obviously many sectors that are interesting here. So I'd find the one that I was most passionate about, but it would tend to be one of these kind of what I think of as third wave sectors, which are, I think, the most important aspects of our lives, and also happen to be the biggest sectors of the economy. So I talked to a lot of people, because I've been doing this for, as you said, for a long time, who felt like in some ways they missed the boat, like the internet's now here. Like, I wish it's got done. Like wish I'd been there earlier. I think we've only gotten started, and this third wave will be quite profound in terms of the impact, but also quite significant in terms of the disruption in a variety of different ways. So it's going to require a kind of a different mindset and a different playbook, whether it be the small companies, the entrepreneurs, the startups, or it be the big companies, or the other organizations in those sectors, hospitals, universities, what have you, and also going to put some real pressure on governments, including our government here. How do you think about this third wave, and how do you strike the balance between keeping bad things from happening? We don't want drones to crash in our kids' playgrounds or driverless cars to wreak havoc because of sort of cyber terrorism, and we don't want the drugs our parents take or to kill them. Obviously there's some desire to keep some of that bad stuff from happening, which is obviously the purpose of regulation, but at the same time enable good things to happen, unleash the new possibilities. And actually the government got it pretty right in the internet, as you've written about, that knows early, first of all, did through DARPA fund it to create it, to get credit for that. Judge Green, a few blocks from here, broke up Ma Bell, the phone company, hugely important in terms of unleashing innovation. When we started, the reason it was only 1 hour a week, it cost $10 an hour to be connected. So how do you get that down to essentially pennies an hour, and then kind of essentially nothing? That really required kind of competition, so that breaking up the phone company, that judicial decision was critically important. And then the legislative decision of Congress to pass the Telecom Act. The other thing that people find amusing is when we got started in 1985, it was illegal for consumers or businesses to connect to the internet. At the time, it was restricted to government use and educational use. So if you worked for a government agency or you were a student on a college campus, you could use the internet, but if you couldn't use it at home, and businesses couldn't use it. It was only when Congress passed the Telecom Act, which commercialized access to the internet, that became kind of much more important.
Wow, there's a lot of history there. We've spent the day trying to look forward, and we've talked about what it is, and in this sense, this is part of the good part of the Trump challenge, if you will, is what can we do to keep our country, to keep our workers well paid? What is it we can do? What kind of education from K through 12, right, beyond graduate degrees, what kind of training programs, whether we need immigration? We've covered a lot of range of things, but one thing we didn't talk about at all is hard work in menial and other jobs. Now, you had a job for a year, I think it was after graduate, you worked at Pizza Hut for a year. You were like a pizza taster or something, or
It was a little better than that. It's actually a pretty good title. I was the director of new pizza development. That was me. They actually paid money to, I was the director of new corporate headquarters. Ah, yes, my card, director of new pizza development.
It's the best title you ever had.
It's an awesome title. And it's how do you create, and back then, I guess it's again, 35 plus years. It was things like delivery, which now with Domino's and Pizza people take for granted, was still kind of in trials, and different kinds of. So there was a bunch of things that were kind of innovative that were being kicked around there. So I wasn't really delivering the pizza or making the pizza, but I was envisioning the future of pizza.
Well, but you had a series of jobs as you were working your way up. And what I loved is that you actually do what I always do, which is I do a pluses and minuses column, and you reproduced yours from your first big job decision of whether you join a startup or not. But before that, could you talk about your view of kids and experiences? Because a lot's changed. We put a lot of our kids now into these programs where they're improving the resume rather than getting a job as a busboy or a newspaper deliverer.
Yeah, it's complicated. Different people obviously have different passions and different interests, and there is some value in terms of the basics, and there is certainly value in terms of coding. But I also think there's value in terms of creativity and value in terms of collaboration, skills which I think are going to be critically important in the third wave. So I'm always encourage people who want to create coding academies and encourage more people to go into STEM subjects and so forth. Obviously, we need a lot of people with that expertise, but not everybody's going to have that desire or aptitude. And we should recognize that part of at the end of the day, entrepreneurs just imagine new possibilities. It's like pattern recognition. They see some things and kind of connect the dots and say, I think it's going to go that way. I'm kind of like Gretzky in hockey. I'm going to go where the puck's going, not where the puck is. Well, that requires creativity. That requires kind of being able to take a step back and have a broader perspective. And the collaboration. This is going to be one of these central skills in this next couple decades in the third wave. It's true in business. It's obviously true in government. Part of the reason there's gridlock in this town is essentially mistrust. They're not relationships. There's not an environment that lends itself to collaboration. And so often, occasionally there's exceptions, but often people are kind of talking past each other. A skill around collaboration, working with people, partnering, understanding, listening is critically important. And that's going to be critically important again in this third wave. The companies that get this right are going to be the winners of the third wave. And the second wave, you could go alone. Mark Zuckerberg actually didn't need partners. He had a really cool idea and took off like wildfire. Snapchat did not need partners. They just launched it was a better kind of photo app and social sharing app, and it took off and got viral adoption, and so but they need partners. If you want to revolutionize healthcare, there are things you could do with apps. There are things you could do with kind of wearable devices and so forth. And obviously, there's been a lot of innovation. You see a lot of it at CES. But the real revolution in healthcare is figuring out ways to work with doctors and work with hospitals and be part of a health reimbursement system with insurance companies, which requires collaborating with them, not dissing them, not saying they're not relevant, not being respectful, figuring out, understanding what's driving it, understanding the dynamics, including the culture of some of these sectors, and figuring out a way to kind of establish a win-win partnership. You want to really revolutionize education. Again, there's great things happening with apps and Khan Academy and so forth, and I think it's terrific. But still, most of the learning is going to happen in classrooms. Most of the learning is still going to happen on campuses. So how do you partner with the teachers and the professors and the institutions there and figure out ways to help them create more personalized, adaptive approaches to learning? So in terms of education, it's some of these skills that are going to be much more important in the future. And some of that goes back to this issue, which I'm sure you talked about today. There are new technologies, AI and robotics and driverless cars and so forth, that clearly are going to destroy jobs. They just are.
That's why we're here today.
That is the history of technology. And 200 years ago, over 90% of us worked on farms. Now it's less than 2%. 88% of us lost our jobs because of technology. You actually could farm more efficiently for a whole host of reasons. But thankfully, we followed that agricultural revolution with the industrial revolutions. A lot of people who lost jobs there created jobs there. And then we followed that with the technology revolution, the digital revolution, which created a lot of jobs. So we're going to lose jobs, that's for sure. The only question is, are we going to create enough jobs to at least partially offset the jobs we lose? And we're not going to do that unless we kind of lean into this opportunity, understand the dynamics are different in the third wave, get the policy right, and particularly figure out a way to level the playing field in terms of opportunity. Right now, it does matter where you live. Last year, 78% of venture capital went to California, New York, and Massachusetts. 3 states got nearly 80% of venture capital. California alone got 50%. And I love Silicon Valley, I love California. There are a lot of great entrepreneurs in the rest of the country.
And no one in the country has done more than you to try to change that with your bus
tour. And obviously I'm failing because we're at 80% in 3 states. So
but you were writing $100,000 checks to the winners. I helped you judge in one of the states to entrepreneurs that came in and presented. And you have done so much. You also were getting behind funding with the Jobs Act, which allowed basically people to go online and fund, although the SEC did delay it a little bit too long, and there's still some issues. But let me ask you this question. You wrote this great book. It really did very well. But then 2 things happened after you wrote the book. One is you met with the Pope, and 2 is you, like most of us, were surprised with the election. And that seemed to have changed your thinking a little bit. Could you talk about that?
Well, I was surprised. I wasn't completely shocked by the Trump victory. Partly because I'd spent a lot of time on the road, and I knew there were a lot of people in a lot of parts of the country that did feel left out and left behind by digitization and by globalization. You could see it, you could hear it, you could feel it. And if you look at the data again, it's not that they feel left behind. They were left behind. If you're only funding the entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley that are creating disruptive technologies that are destroying jobs in the middle of the country, and you're not backing the entrepreneurs in the middle of the country who can create companies there that create jobs there, no wonder we have a problem. So I was surprised. I didn't think he was going to pull it off, and I had some concerns, as we've discussed, around some of the things he was saying around immigration and the lack of clarity and specificity around tech policy, innovation policy, and so forth. But he just tapped into a vein that was a pretty deep vein of people who kind of felt like it was time to kind of try something else and shake the snow globe in D.C. And it didn't seem like things were going in their direction, so why not take another shot? And so that dynamic, I did add a chapter with laying out a framework of some of the things that need to be focused on, many of them which you talked about today, what is the right regulatory approach in the third wave? How do you, as I mentioned, kind of strike the right balance there? What is the right approach on immigration? We've got to continue to win what's now a global battle for talent. We've got to deal with some of these issues like the startup visa, the international entrepreneur rule. I understand the politics are complicated, the issue's emotional, but we've got to figure out a way to prevail on that. We've got to develop more of these startup communities, create more of a network effect within each of the communities, create more of a sense of possibility, almost fearlessness in these communities, get money in those communities off the sidelines to back the startups, get the investors on the coast to pay attention, to startups. There are some policy things there. When the tax reform issues got bubbling in the next few months, I hope there's a real bias towards job creation and things like the Investing in Opportunity Act was introduced in a bipartisan way last year by Senators Scott and Booker. Basically created some capital gains deferral incentives to invest in these, rise of the rest regions. So that's going to be kind of very important. There's a bunch of things that need to be put in place to kind of get this policy framework right. The last point on the Pope happened to be at a conference at the Vatican in December, and part of it was on kind of the future of business and what is the role of business and kind of how to make sure businesses, while of course focusing on profit, also focus on purpose, also focus on impact, also recognize the role they play in our communities, in our society, and how do you come up with almost a new twist on capitalism that has a little bit more of a long-term orientation, a little bit more of an impact orientation. And the Pope did say one thing that I thought I was quite struck by, and it ties in with this debate about the negatives that some fear of a dystopian jobless future that leads to figuring out kind of safety net proposals like a universal basic income or something like that. My view on that is maybe we have to do that, but let's do it as the last resort. After we've tried everything else, let's try create the jobs, not as the default. And it goes back to the Pope said, which is jobs are not about income. Of course, that's part of it, but it's about dignity and purpose and self-respect. So creating jobs for people in the future has to be our focus, which is why having this conference today is so important.
Well, thank you. One of the other things you said, I think, in that chapter, which resonated with me, was there's been a sea change just in a few years about how big companies approach startups. They used to be a nuisance or an irrelevancy. A few of them had venture arms. Maybe they'd make some investments. But it seems lately there's been a huge change in just attitude by big companies. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, no, it has been. It's been encouraging. Now, some of that is people proactively kind of seeing the benefits of startups in terms of their industries and even in terms of their communities. The communities that invested in entrepreneurs, invested in startups, now suddenly have larger companies. Every Fortune 500 company starts a startup. So if you, kind of like the seed corn, if you're not kind of planting the seed corn and fertilizing the seed corn, you're going to wake up someday and you're not going to say, where all the jobs go? Where are all the big companies? Well, some of them went by the wayside and you didn't create some new ones to offset that. So some of the people are starting to recognize that. And feel a responsibility to play a role in doing that. We've seen that in a bunch of cities. And the others, it kind of ties with this third wave kind of thesis, which is they now realize that the center of gravity around innovation and disruption is now heading their way. And they don't want to be left behind, and therefore engaging with startups that do have interesting ideas that are more agile and figuring out some way to work together becomes quite important. And some really large companies are just trying to kind of reposition their portfolio of businesses so they have a portfolio that will play well in the future as opposed to clinging to the kind of the historical view and kind of looking in the rear view mirror. And that's critically important because they're very helpful in terms of getting these startups traction, particularly in these third wave sectors, healthcare, education being good examples. The startups actually need these kind of partnerships to get distribution, to have credibility, sometimes understand some of the policy implications. The big companies need that sense of kind of possibility, the fresh thinking, agility that comes from the small companies. So that's going to be, as I said earlier, one of the key skill sets, whether it be the small company or the big companies, is how do you drive those partnerships.
We have time for a question. I see one. Is that Jim Burgess? Berger, I'm sorry.
Well, you ought to know by now, Gary. But Gary,
sorry,
seriously,
Jim, I could barely see you.
Thank you for putting on a great conference. Really very good. And Steve, I missed the first wave back in 1985 when I told the headhunter I wasn't interested in the general counsel position at this little startup in Vienna.
You were not alone. There are a lot of people who rejected us.
I went to work for Apple
And
instead.
for a decade, my parents couldn't quite figure out what I was doing and thought it was not working out so well. So,
But I want to turn to K-12, which is a passion of mine. You mentioned a number of things that have been mentioned a lot today that's missing in our education system, like giving kids critical thinking skills, good computational skills, communication skills, teamwork, collaboration. By the way, you know what they call collaboration in the classroom? Cheating.
right.
Jim, what's your question?
My question is, how do we solve this? Are we going to have to do something outside, like after-school programs, to give this kind of creativity and skills to children?
Well, I think you have to try a bunch of different things and really create systems that are more open to experimentation. I met a guy last week at the TED conference who's doing some interesting kind of summer programs that I thought seemed to be getting some traction. One of the cities we visited on this Rise the Rest tour that struck me as an interesting and surprising to me hotbed for innovation was New Orleans. And the reason was because post-Katrina, they decided to basically reinvent their school system. I think it was told that 70% of the schools pre-Katrina were failing. The schools themselves had failing grades. So they said, okay, Katrina, huge problem, crisis, obviously terrible, but let's at least try to figure out how to turn some of that into an opportunity. And that led to rethinking the school system and charter schools and other kinds of things. As a result, it's sort of a newbie school system. They're much more open to trying things. And they also attracted a lot of talent. Teach for America and other people came down there to help kind of rebuild New Orleans. A lot of people stayed there. And there's dozens of ed tech startups now in New Orleans because there's some people decided they like New Orleans, and because New Orleans is more open to trying stuff, and therefore that experimentation that's so critical for entrepreneurs, that's more of a canvas they can paint on than many other places. We've seen other companies. I remember the winner in our Rise the Rest pitch competition in Iowa, a company called Pear Deck was doing some interesting things there. So I mean, these things are happening. The question is how it goes back to partnerships. How do you help these entrepreneurs connect to some of these kind of school systems, or maybe connect to some of the big distribution powerhouses, Pearson or others, so they actually can take their idea and make it real and have real scale. It's not, again, not just an app, it's how it gets integrated and applied. So I think it's going to require a bunch of different things and a bunch of different experiments and a bunch of people running these schools, being open to trying different things and then finding the things that are working and then figuring out ways to really scale them up.
So, Steve, one of the proposals that's been hanging out there is that every fourth grader and on in the U.S. be exposed to software programming, basic skills. What do you think?
I think it's a good idea to expose them. Again, I think it's to presume that everybody's going to become a coder. I just don't think it's realistic. Everybody's not going to become anything.
Well, most of us have had to take trigonometry, but we're not always using it.
I must say, when I was in college, I almost didn't graduate because of a computer 101 class. So,
oh, really?
I hated it. This is
There you have it.
punch card era. It's like, this is the most mindless thing. I have to type this stupid program and then wait like 4 hours for the punch cards to be run. And then it come back and say, you dummy, it didn't work. I have to go do it again. So I was not a big fan of my first computing experience. But it did give me a sense, well, wow, this could be really powerful. Like if it was easier to use and more useful, more fun, more affordable, hey, there might be something here. So
I guess there was.
Some of these terrible experiences lead to insights that kind of move in a different direction. So I think exposing people to those skills are important. Exposing people to the idea of entrepreneurship. Most people don't know what an entrepreneur is. Many people have never experienced that. There's some interesting programs, a little bit different, but interesting programs in prisons. Trying to kind of help provide some skill set. A lot of the people who are in prison actually are pretty entrepreneurial. They just happen to live in neighborhoods where they didn't have a path to start a company. They had a path to become a drug dealer or some other thing. So, how do you instill some of these expose people to different paths, give them different on-ramps, and different people will decide which path to take. But I think we got to go beyond what we've been doing and say the world is changing. How do we teach our kids to do things that machines can't do? And that's where creativity and collaboration, a lot of those things become so important.
Final quick question. Looking just in the short term, the next year and a half of this Congress, this president, what would you like to see happen that you think is realistic?
Well, realistic is hard to say. I remember when we were doing the Jobs Act 5 years ago, people said you're wasting your time because it's an election year and absolutely nothing will move. And the White House supported it and Congress supported it in a bipartisan way, and it passed. And so I think my view is it's not easy. The path is sometimes circuitous, but anything is possible. I think there's a big opportunity because this president particularly should champion startups in the middle of the country. That's why he won. A lot of people in Ohio and Michigan and Pennsylvania and many other parts of the country feeling like they didn't have a future. So things like the Investing in Opportunity Act, where there's capital gains incentives, should be kind of front and center. He wants to talk about less regulation. What are the appropriate regulations for these sectors, and recognizing some of these technologies are converging, so you can't just view them as silos. You have to view it in a more integrated way. Obviously, he said some terrible things around immigration, but I actually believe he understands the importance of the high-skilled immigration. So something like a startup visa or this international entrepreneur rule, I think he might champion, and if he does champion, probably can bring his constituencies along with him for the ride. So there's a bunch of things that can be done, and even this current healthcare debate, I haven't focused on all the details, and the state of play seems sort of fluid. But there were things in the Affordable Care Act that were very helpful in terms of incenting innovation in terms of the startup sector, and also even the portability of health plans will allow people to leave big companies to do startups. So we need to make sure we preserve some of those aspects, irrespective if we're repealing and replacing or tweaking. What are the things that really kind of strike at the core? So like the Jobs Act, I have not yet found a Republican or a Democrat in the House or the Senate who's not in favor of job creation, who's not in favor of innovation, who's not in favor of entrepreneurship, who's not in favor of making sure this country remains the most innovative entrepreneurial nation, not in favor of trying to create opportunity where the playing field is more level, and it's not so much where you live or who you know or what you look like. But the data, by the way, is even worse. We talked about 78% to 3 states. 90% of venture capital last year went to men, 10% to women. 1% went to African Americans. So it actually does matter. Like if you happen to go to Stanford and happen to be Silicon Valley and happen to be like a white guy, it's pretty good. But not everybody who's in Silicon Valley going to Stanford is a white guy. And what about the rest of the world? And so, championing that in terms of creating opportunities and on-ramps. Again, a lot of people will fail, but everybody should have the opportunity to succeed if they want to take an idea and make it real. I think there is broad support for that. So this is a place where there should be even infrastructure. Some of the debate around infrastructure will be about rebuilding roads and bridges and so forth, which we need to do. We also need to build better digital infrastructure and broadband and things like that, and ties in with the rise of the rest. There are a lot of kind of communities that don't have the connectivity they need to be competitive. So there are a bunch of things, it seems, that there are many issues that are big divides, big divisions. There are a few places where there seems like there can and should be common ground. This is one of them.
Well, thank you, Steve. You are truly a national hero and a digital patriot.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you all.
Thank you so much.